So we've got a group of people in the room here tonight, sort of 10, 15 people in the room, more than 100 people online, which is quite intimidating to think about out loud. I'll just put that from my mind. But seamlessly now, it's going to be delivered a hybrid event tonight. We've got 3 speakers, and then we'll take any questions at the end. We should be able to take questions either from the audience in the room or from our Zoom audience online. We're going to have Professor Thomas Clancy from the University of Glasgow, who's been the sort of overarching presence through this project, has overseen the work of the place names of the Galloway Glens project, supported by Gilbert Marcus, our second speaker, who's been the sort of driving force on the ground, meeting people, noting down stories about place names and pulling together the actual database. And then delighted to have Dr. Colin Mackenzie as our third speaker, who drives the local Dumfries and Galloway place names social media accounts. And it's quite interesting to see the sort of the thought behind the original project, the deliverer of the project, and then possibly a sort of user of the project at the end of it. So it's why are Galloway place names interesting, and what has this project done to shed some light on that? I think, Thomas, I'm happy to hand over to you if you're ready.
Well, good evening. It's very good to see you all here tonight. I'm going to be just spending a very brief amount of time. I'm just the kind of warm-up act for everything else. And I just wanted to say a little bit about the project that we did and are still, I suppose, delivering bits and pieces of now, by way of just giving a bit of context in how it fits. And then I'll turn over to Gilbert and Colin, who will be the kind of meat of the evening for you. So obviously we sit within, our project was a project within this greater Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership, which many of you will be extremely familiar with, and a fantastic 5-year project that's just done such wonderful things. So it's been a joy to be a small bit within that. So just to say a little bit about the project itself, Gilbert, myself, and our colleague Simon Taylor were the people most involved in the project. I was sort of the bag man for the project, and Gilbert did the vast bulk of the research on it over the course of a very hectic year and a bit. The 3 of us have worked on place name projects before elsewhere in Fife, and I've worked with Simon in Kinrossshire, Clackmannanshire. Gilbert's worked on the Isle of Bute as well. So it was sort of bringing, I guess, sort of outside expertise of how place names work and how place names in Scotland work into an area that none of the 3 of us were extremely familiar with. I was probably the one most familiar with this area. So that has its issues, and something that maybe Colin can talk about later on in terms of a kind of local perspective on things. Our purpose was to design a web resource for the place names of the Galloway Glens, and Gilbert, along with someone I've not mentioned on this slide, and I should have done, Brian Aitken, our systems developer, who designed the kind of tech aspect of the web resource, and who really ought to be on this slide. Sorry, Brian. This was launched in 2020 in the middle of COVID, so the word kind of trickled out. So one of the purposes of today, we've been doing this event up the D and the Ken over the course of the day, is to sort of celebrate place names in Galloway, but also to just raise awareness of the fact that this resource is there for people to play with. And Gilbert will talk a little bit more about what's on it and what you can get from it. So that was created, and it exists. There are still things that we'd like to do with this, including the event today, and hopefully do something or a couple of somethings in the spring. We hope a booklet about sort of summarizing the work will be coming, and one day in the very distant future, the work that we've done will form part of a kind of academic presentation of the first volume. So the Galloway Glens will get to be the first volume in the place names of Kirkcudbrightshire, part of the survey of Scottish place names county series, and that's why their logo is on that. And I'm the director of that survey, for what it's worth. Back in the early days, I'm not quite sure we knew exactly what we were getting ourselves into. That's us up at Dalry Mott in the early days of the project. But we did, as I say, get there. And if you go on to the website, you'll be confronted by a welcome page. But the best thing to do is to go on to the actual database itself and play around with the place names. I'm not expecting you to read any of this. I just put those slides up just so you had a sense of what they look like. But Gilbert will be giving you a sense of what they do. But you can work through those place names in lots of different ways from the website. And I said I would talk for a very short amount of time. The one last thing I want to just sort of emphasize is that although we're the place names of the Galloway Glens, we knew that in the course of, we really only had a year to do the actual research. We knew we couldn't get through the whole of the area that the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership covered. So we only did, I'm sure it didn't feel like only to Gilbert, 7 parishes up at the top end of the Galloway Glens area. So Cursfairn, Dalry, Kells, Balmaclellan, Parton, Balmagee, and Crossmichael. So we didn't come down as far as Kirkcudbright, although the name Kirkcudbright is in the database. And there's, as a result, not everything in this area. There's a lot of work still to be done, I guess, is the emphasis here. I think we proved what you could potentially do in a short space of time, but to do more, we need more time, more people's involvement. And again, I think that's something that Colin will be talking a little bit about. So that I just wanted to summarize the kind of project and the context in which the next 2 more substantial talks will be happening. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Gilbert to talk about what he's going to talk about. I'll let him tell you what that is. Right, over to Gilbert.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, a snapshot of my background. I work at the University of Glasgow. I'm in the Celtic and Gaelic department, and I've been working on various place names projects. And a lot of my other main area of research is in early medieval history, landscape, culture, belief, language change, religious practice, and so on. So those are that's my real area of interest, but place names are a very important part of that, and my interest in place names extends beyond the early. It's one of the few things that drags me out of the 7th century is a good collection of place names. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a fair amount this evening about early medieval history because that's where my heart is in many ways, but I'll be doing so through place names. So we have around 2,400 place names. I added a new one yesterday to the database, and they're all fed into this database system with categories of language, of what kind of a site it is, where it is, its early forms, and so on. Thomas has already told you about the 7 parishes we're using. So most of my work has actually been gathering data. You look at a place name, you stare at it very hard, and you wonder what it could possibly mean. You wonder what language it could possibly have been coined in, and that's not always self-evident. Muirdroch Wood, as it looks like on the map, is actually Murdrochit. That looks like it could be a Scots name. It's actually a Gaelic name. It's the markland of the bridge, Mark Drochacha in Gaelic. So you have to think about each individual name quite carefully, and you want to collect lots of early forms of that name. I wonder if yes. So a lot of the process is trailing through old maps and medieval charters and property records to find early forms of the name, because that Mac Drochet in 1592 and Mar Drochet in 1645, they begin to make you realize that this is not Muirdroch Wood at all, as does the pronunciation. So collecting pronunciations from local people, also a very important part of the collection process, and an important part of, if people call it Mardrochet, you can be quite certain it is not Muirdroch Wood. It's the emphasis on the stress pattern of the name is quite different. So that's the data collection. That's got to be done 2,400 times, one for each name, that process of collection. And you end up with lots of names explained, sometimes with a reasonable degree of certainty, and sometimes with a high degree of doubt. And that's a long, and it's an ongoing process. And sometimes we will find 5 years later that we can suddenly make sense of a name, maybe an early form has appeared or something that suddenly makes sense of it. And if you want to understand an individual name, you can go and look at the database, look up that name on the database and say Muirdroch Wood and type it in, and immediately the database will tell you, it's not Muirdroch Wood, it's Mardrochet, and it means this, and this is how you pronounce it, okay? So you can do, if you're interested in an individual name, that's grand. But the real power of the database, having collected all these individual names and analyzed them individually and collected the early forms and all the rest of it, and located them in the landscape, the real power of it is when you start using it to generate maps, for example, to visualize distributions. So that's what I want to do this evening. That's why I call this thing squeezing the data. We've collected the data. That took about 1.5 years, and it's still little trickles coming in. The next stage is to enjoy ourselves, playing with the database, to squeeze it, to form patterns, to see what's going on. So here we have the earliest layer of languages spoken in this area, which have left a mark on the toponymic landscape, is a language which in our database we call Brittonic. Some people also call it Brythonic, some people call it Old Welsh, some people call it Cumbric or Cumbrian. But basically it's that P-Celtic, that language which is kind of ancestral or the early medieval language akin to modern Welsh, okay? So if you think about it in that way. And that's the earliest layer of language we have. The very earliest name we have from this project area is the River Dee. That appears in the mid-2nd century as Deva on Ptolemy's geography of the British Isles. So Deva means goddess. So this is a river which is occupied by a goddess, by a divine presence, if you like. That's the earliest place name the earliest reference to any place name in this area, and that is a P-Celtic word. Again, it's the language ancestral to Welsh. There are several other names which might or might not be Brittonic, but the ones which are pretty transparently Brittonic are the ones which contain the word trev, which means a farmstead, basically. It's related to the Irish word for ploughing, interestingly, which is also pronounced trev. It's related to the modern Welsh term trev, which means a farm or a farmstead or farming. You know, they're talking about not just, you know, a farmer and his dog. We're talking about a farm community in the landscape. And these are probably quite substantial farms. And it's interesting that out of all the British names that have survived, it's only a dozen or a dozen and a half, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them are trev names. Trev seems to have a certain kind of stability in the landscape. They're all in the valley, in the fairly fertile and mostly arable part of our study area. So does that help to explain why they survived? I mean, this whole area must have been once awash with Brittonic place names, but only this 16, 18 or so have survived. And a lot of them are trevs, perhaps because the trev is a fairly important kind of settlement name, an element which describes or refers to a fairly stable and strong farming community. So, and because it's on this good land, perhaps it explains that kind of emergence of trevs in that area. But it does seem significant. So it does make us ask a question about why does a name that's more than 1,000 years old, possibly, survive the later appearance of lots of other languages also attempting to give place names to the landscape? What makes some things survive and some things not survive? Why does this survival pattern appear? That's an interesting research question. It bears. What these things do is allows us to look at these distributions or other features of our data set and ask interesting questions, which are not just about what does this name mean, but what's going on with language change, with lordship, with ecclesiastical organization, with violence. What's going on in this landscape? Land use and so on. How is the economy organized? Who's in charge? Who's Who are the serfs? All those kind of questions. They raise questions about which and they might also help to provide answers to some of those questions. The next layer of language, we might say, is what people call Old English. Here, because of the 7th century expansion of the Northumbrian kingdom around Bamborough, Lindisfarne, Berwick, that kind of area, expanding west into the east, taking over the overlordship of this territory. We have a little cluster of Old English or Anglo-Saxon or Northumbrian names. Some of them are fairly certain. We're fairly certain about what they mean. Swinton doesn't actually survive on its own, but there's a Glen Swinton. And that's interesting because you have a Swinton, a pig farm, a swine tune, okay, which no longer exists as Swinton, but in the Gaelic-speaking period, the next layer of language, if you like, the name Swinton was borrowed into a Gaelic place name. It's called an ex nomine place name, a name built on another name. So we have a Gaelic name containing an Anglo-Saxon name. So we're talking about the encounters between different languages here. In this case, it's an illustration of succession, that a Brittonic name has been taken over into an Old English name. We have Shermers. The Sher part seems to be the Shire word, and Mer, Gamer is a boundary. And Shermers actually forms the boundary of the estate of what is now the parish of Parton, which is also an Anglo-Saxon name, either meaning enclosure town or perhaps pear town. A pear orchard, maybe a specialist orchard farm there. We can't be clear about that first element, but it's certainly pretty surely an Anglo-Saxon name. And that was perhaps the Skeer, the Anglo-Saxon lordship of which Shermers was the northern boundary. The earliest reference to Kirkcudbright is actually shows it as an Anglo-Saxon name. Kirkcudbright is actually a Gaelic name. Thomas has shown that the word kirk, originally a Germanic word, which went into church and kirk in Scots, but also in Norse as kirk, was borrowed into Gaelic, really pretty much in this part of southwest Scotland, and replaced kill. Kill is the usual word for a church. So you get Kilbride, Kilwinning, and all these places. But here we have Cuthberichtskirche is the Anglo-Saxon form, and Kirkcudbright is the Gaelic form. That rather surprises people. If they haven't read Thomas, they don't know that Kirk is actually a Gaelic loanword. And again, a loanword from Norse-flavored Anglo-Saxon or Norse, or I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out, but that Germanic stratum being borrowed into Gaelic. Again, the interaction of languages and language communities. This is Daphne Brooks' map of the area, showing all the Anglian place names, Northumbrian place names. Interesting how there's a whole bunch of them actually come up our up the Nith. Is it? No, up the D. Sorry, up the D. Yeah, beg its pardon. And I'm not entirely sure that you got all these right actually, because the ones higher up the Glen don't seem to me to be totally convincing. But it does give you a picture of a fairly coastal distribution of where are the Anglo-Saxon lordships being formed in a way which establishes their presence through place names. What is the relationship between these Anglo-Saxon lordships close to the shore and the presumably continuing Brittonic speakers further inland? Did they exercise complete overlordship over them? Did they simply control the coastal resources which those people higher up the glens needed to get access to? I mean, there's a whole interesting kind of social political question to be asked about what is the relationship between these two communities. And that might have been a fiscal relationship, or an economic relationship, a political relationship, or a cultural and linguistic relationship. And those things aren't all necessarily the same thing. They operate at different levels. mentioned Glen Swinton, with the Swinton being, the pig farm being loaned into the Glen word. Then we have this Old Norse influx from probably the early 9th century onwards, perhaps even a little bit, probably not in the late 8th century, but they're not settling, but the Vikings arrive at the end of the 8th century. This Norse presence appears in Galloway, very strongly, actually, fairly strongly, but not in our area, interestingly. So the project area, the study area which we've been looking at, does not have a single certain Old Norse place name in it. You've got Fell, as which is now a farm name at the foot of Fell Hill, but Fell Hill was presumably the original Fell. It's the highest hill in the parish. Fell is a word which comes from Norse, but it comes into Scots, and we have a whole bunch of Scots Fell names, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. And I think the Fell in our study area is another one of those Scots place names. There's no reason really to think it's Norse. And if you look at here we have, this map shows the boundary of our study area and the Norse place names identified by Daphne Brooke. Again, that's similar coastal distribution. Yet remember, the Norse polity at this period is really, it's a maritime entity, or a series of interconnected entities. These are people who make their livelihoods largely in coastal areas with a very strong emphasis on maritime, mercantile, slave trading, regular trading, and farming along the coastal areas. But this is a kind of Irish sea zone, including the Isle of Man, the east of Ireland, parts of Cumbria, and Western England, and the Galloway coast. And this this distribution of place names manifests that kind of essentially maritime organization of their world. So just let me to highlight again, number 10, the one in a blue, in a red circle, I'm also pretty sure is not a Norse place name. So that gets us even further away from having a Norse presence in our area. So does this shed any light on anything else? I mean, how can we use these distribution maps, these patterns formed by the place name data that we've collected? How can we use those to invent other questions or to help answer other questions? So let me just think a little bit out loud about the Galloway hoard. I don't know, about 4, 5, 6 years ago, this fantastic collection of treasure, of silver, of ecclesiastical artwork and crosses, and it's silver and gold and exotic things from Afghanistan. I can't remember what it was that came from out there. And it was something from northern Afghanistan, southern Russia, whether the border is there. And I can't remember what the artifact was. Oh, it's the pot. It's the big pot that half of this stuff was hiding in, that's right. Sasanian pot. So what was it doing there? How did it get there? Who put it there and why? Why was it buried? It was buried in the churchyard of Balmagee. Used to be called Kirk Andrews. The Andrew dedication possibly having been imported from Hexham, because this place was part of the territory of the Bishop of Hexham in the early Middle Ages. So, and Hexham was dedicated to St. Andrew. So the Kirk Andrews dedication at Balmagee, very possibly inspired by that Hexham connection. But you see, there's a clear gap between the find spot of this treasure, this hoard, and the distribution of Norse place names. One of the things that the press was running with when this hoard was discovered was this was a Viking hoard, that the Vikings had trashed someplace, grabbed the treasure, and buried it. Well, the problem with that theory is partly they buried it in. If it was Viking treasure, why did they bury it having stolen it from what looks like a church an ecclesiastical original owner, they took it to a church somewhere else and buried it in that church instead. Not obvious Viking behavior. Father, would you please look after this treasure for us? You know, so it's outside their home zone. It's outside the zone of Norse control. It's well beyond the Norse place names. So it's much more likely, it seems to me, that it was taken for safekeeping by some clergyman or group of clergymen or local people who wanted to protect this treasure from unfortunate things happening to it in the church where it had originally been. In the 9th century, archaeology has shown that the church at Whithorn, which was the church of the Anglian bishops of Galloway, it wasn't called Galloway then, the bishop's see of Whithorn was catastrophically burned during the 9th century. Nobody knows why, but what we have is there's no chronicle record of it, but it was destroyed by fire in the 9th century. That's quite possibly means that that could be interpreted as a Viking raid, but it's a guess. It could have just been an accident. Somebody left the porridge on too long or something, you know. But had there been a raid at Whithorn, the natural thing to do would have been to take the valuables away out of the zone of Norse activity and hide it in a sympathetic milieu. And what could be more sympathetic than Kirkandrews, Balmagee? Another thing would be really puzzling if it was a Viking pillaging treasure would be that they buried lots of very valuable things alongside things that had no value at all to a Viking, like these little balls of mud, which are probably relics from a saint's grave. People would take a little ball of wet clay, roll it into a ball, roll it around in the dust of the grave, and then take it home with them and dry it out, and they had permanent second-class relics of the saint whom they had visited. There's no reason at all for a Viking to collect and hide that kind of treasure, but every reason for a senior clergyman to do so. One of the fantastic pieces in this collection was a little glass flask, crystal, not much used to a Viking, but it's covered in gold wire as a beautiful kind of artistic decoration. But on the bottom, I don't know if you can see it very clearly in this, there's writing on the base of this cross, and it says Higwald Episcopus facere usit. Higwald the bishop commanded to make it. This is a bishop's, probably, my guess is it's like to have been used for chrism, for the oil of anointing, which the bishops used regularly for various rituals, especially baptism, confirmation, and for the ordaining of clergy. So if this was taken from Whithorn, you know, it's a bit of a guess, but he's the only local bishop in the area, is the Bishop of Whithorn. If this was taken from Whithorn, either at the time of the catastrophic fire or perhaps some decades later, nearer to the year 900, which is roughly when they think it was built. This Bishop Higwald, who's otherwise unattested, we don't know anything about him otherwise, it's quite possible that he is the bishop or a bishop after the last attested Anglian bishop of Whithorn, who was Beardwulf, who died in 803. So sometime in the 9th century, perhaps, there was another bishop called Higwald ruling the church at Whithorn. And the only record we have of him is on the bottom of his ecclesiastical crockery, where his name appears. And then we have no other name of any other bishop until Fergus of Galloway arranges for Gilla Alden to become the bishop of his newly established church in Whithorn. Again, it's guesswork, but it's the kind of guesswork which is inspired, which we're able to make because we know something about the pattern of Norse settlement, and we know something about the pattern of Norse settlement from the place names. And here are all the Gaelic names, 590 of them. You sometimes hear people saying that Gaelic was never spoken in this part of the world, which is a really strange thing to say, but you get people saying this all over Scotland, and they're very often standing in a place with a Gaelic place name attached to it, insisting that there's never any Gaelic spoken here. So that's 25% of our place names are in Gaelic, and you know, a lot of the other place names formed in Scots or English are derived from Gaelic place names. So you've got Balmaclellan, you've got Upper Balmaclellan and Nether Balmaclellan and Balmaclellan Post Office, or whatever it might be. So that these Gaelic a lot of the Scots names or English names are actually formed using Gaelic original elements. So just to give you a sense of just how widespread Gaelic was in our territory, and pretty uniformly spread, not like Norse or Old English, where it's confined to a particular zone. This Gaelic spread thoroughly throughout the area. So we have this layering of language. What I don't want to suggest is that there's a simple process by which one language replaced the other. We have British to begin with, and it probably was pretty much a monolithic language, this Brittonic P-Celtic language, which was here. But once the Old English language started appearing, it didn't simply displace Brittonic. They existed cheek by jowl, and there must have been relationships between those two communities, which we could perhaps, if we squeeze this data a bit harder, begin to learn something about what kind of relationship that was. And then there's a period of when the Gal Gael means the foreign Gaels, and foreign basically means, in some sense, Scandinavian, okay? So the Gal Gael, who gave their name to Galloway, the Galloway simply means the place of the Gal Gael, they bring Gaelic with them, but Norse continues in that coastal strip. British probably continues up until the 12th century, perhaps, up in the higher parts of our study area. Old English continues in some shape or form for some of that period as well. So there's an interplay of languages, and they're borrowing words from each other, they're borrowing place name elements from each other, they're borrowing whole names and incorporating them into new names in their own language. Gradually that fizzy multiculturalism settles down into a primarily Gaelic and perhaps to some extent British continuum, and then that fades into Gaelic Scots and then simply Scots in English. But I don't want to give the impression, when I talk about the layering of languages, I don't want to give the impression that it's a fairly simple stratification. There's a lot of interpenetration going on at all levels. Finally, let me just say, I'll just talk about Desnes, or Desnes, perhaps it should be pronounced, seems to be the promontory of the River Dee. And this is one of the things that I want to look at next in this area is this area of Desnes. If you look at all these red names on here, all of those parishes were part of two deaneries, one called Desnes Moor, Big Desnes, that is, the main one, or perhaps the more important one, and the ones to the east of the river are Desnes Ewan, probably meaning John, that Desnes belonging to John. So that has been a single territory which has been subdivided into two territories by the river Ur. Ur is the Gaelic name for a boundary. So in the 12th century, it seems that the aggressive expansionism of the King of Scots took hold of Desnes Ewan to the east of the river and incorporated it into the Diocese of Glasgow, leaving Desnes Moor, as it still is, in the Diocese of Galloway. So in the 12th century, we can see suddenly the fact of this single territory with its names being subdivided into two ecclesiastical territories. A political territory is divided into two ecclesiastical territories, and the river between them is called the boundary, Ur. that requires more explanation. And I'm not going to do that tonight. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Oh, hello folks, thanks very much for coming along. It's nice to see you. I'm Colin, I teach at Trequeer Primary School. Trequeer, like Gilbert said, is a Trev name, it's a Brittonic name, so that's quite nice. And before I did that, I studied Old Icelandic at Glasgow. And while I was at Glasgow, I took a course on place names. And for some people, once you start thinking about place names, you just can't stop. And I've just not stopped thinking about place names. And my role tonight really is just to enthuse about the place name database, which I'm happy to do at length, but I'll try and keep it nice and short for you, so there's time for questions. I thought I'd maybe give a wee example of how I've used it and encourage you to do similar things with it, 'cause it's a fab resource. So I run the DG Place Names Twitter account and website. That website's got sort of stories and collections of place names and a wee bit of research too, and some sort of stuff you can't find, stuff that's not been digitized yet, some old Galloway literature. So I'll maybe talk a wee bit about how you can use that website at the end, but for just now, the Galloway Glens database. So I thought what I'd like to do is just talk about how you can explore the database sort of from entry-level exploration to using its API to do all sorts of fun stuff. And then one of the nice things about place names is that they form fairly predictable patterns. They use a fairly constrained set of words, and once you learn a little bit, you can use it to explore the region out with the Galloway Glens. And then what I'd quite like to push towards the end is just what you can, what local knowledge can add to the database, can add to our study of names here, and add to the study of names across the region. And if there's time, I'll talk a wee bit about folklore, a wee bit about minor names, and might have time for Scots place names, but we'll see how that goes. So first of all, if you've not had a look, I'd encourage you to go and look at the database, and you can explore it in a few different ways. You can look at a map and just browse about, see bits where you live, go and click on those. Or another way of doing it is to open up the element glossary, have a look through, see if there's words you find interesting, you can find a wee bit more about it. So just as an example, I looked up the other day some fairly rare Scots names elements. So has, which is your neck, but in place names it's used metaphorically to mean like a defile or stuff. And you can find out where it's used in the landscape in the Galloway Glens. And you can explore that digitally, or you can go out and see it. You can see, well, why was this place called this? Is there a particular shape to the defile? And another one is ligget, which is a self-closing gate, sort of separates two parts of agricultural use in the farm. Basically, it keeps the coos out, and you can find all the places where it's used in here. And incidentally, I'm not sure if folks still use ligget around here. I'd be really interested if they do. The Scots Dictionary stopped recording it around 1900. I'm sure it's still used. It'd be lovely to hear about that. So, once you explore place names, you begin to see patterns. That's a nice thing. You just need to know a little bit. And once you know a little bit, it begins to unlock the landscape for you. You can begin to read the landscape a little bit like a text. And once you get into the habit of that, it's a bit like looking at old photographs. You can see, well, what's similar? What's changed? Can I match the meaning of the name? I go and look up a name. Can I see it in the landscape, or is it something that's been obliterated and changed through time? However, while you get these fairly predictable patterns and sometimes quite prosaic meanings, dare I say it, boring, there's quite a lot of big hills, there's quite a few grey streams and stuff. However, it's hard not to even like the big hills and the wee hills and stuff like that. Inside here, there's always unusual names, and it's quite nice to stumble across those serendipitously. So one thing I'd encourage you to do is just go and have a look, see what stories and meanings lie behind these words. But I picked a couple out at random just to give you an idea of what's maybe there to find. So I really like Strawn Beaver, which appears in Big and Little Strawn Beaver out in Carsfairn and Dalry. It's really interesting because it seems to be a Gaelic name that's borrowed the English or Scots word beaver. And that's fab. Maybe beavers were here before they were hunted to extinction. If the Galloway Glens was looking for a project to bring back the beaver, there's some potential evidence, but the database will also tell you that either disappointingly or interestingly, it might be a reference to the beaver hat. So Strawn from Strawn is like a projecting ridge, and maybe the ridge was metaphorically a bit like a beaver-shaped hat. I'd push the real beavers thing here. It'd be nice to bring them back. And then Luke Stone and Bargain Strand. While I take a wee drink of water, you might want to guess what connects these two. Luke Stone looks fairly prosaic. Other than Luke's a really rare name to get in place now. It hardly occurs at all, but that's what drew my attention to it. But, as is quite often this case in Scotland, they're linked by the deal. So Luke Stone, we're told, is a large granite stone in the form of Moorbrock, where it's traditionally handed down that a man whose Christian name was Luke saw the devil, hence the name. And you get this quite a lot. So this is taken from the Ordnance Survey name books. When the surveyors were out making the first edition 6-inch map, they took down notes of these stories. And it's lovely, you quite often get these bizarre supernatural descriptions just presented at face value, hence the name. And at Bargain Strand, we're told it's handed down by tradition that an old woman that lived convenient to the stream sold herself to the devil, hence the name, fair enough. And you can use the database to interrogate that a bit more, and perhaps this was actually a Gaelic name, something to do with bread, perhaps referring to the landscape. And once that became opaque, people explained that through Bargain Strand. I'll come back to Bargain Strand later because there's a wee bit more about that. And then finally, a nice wee surprise, it's Thundery Nows. So Thundery, again, that's pretty rare, that doesn't turn up too much. But it's quite exciting to realise that it might be like Tundergee or Tandergee, and you get these out in Whithorn, maybe in Dumfriesshire as well. I think Tundergarth might be one as well. And so I presume Gilbert wrote this. So, but I'm gonna primary school mode it. So this perhaps means just backside to the wind. So one, that's super exciting. It's super exciting because, hey, that's a funny name. It's exciting because it's actually a Gaelic phrase. You've got a preposition. That's really exciting as well. But I love this sort of stuff. I would recommend you go and visit, and you can stare at this hill in the landscape and try and engage with the person that named it and the why. So, where I'm up to. So that's a nice way to explore the database. Just go and find stuff. You've got 2,500 names, and some of them are going to be big hill, some of them are going to be fun things like this or exciting things like the devil. If you want to explore the database in a bit more of a structured way, there's whole lots of advanced search features. That's cool. You can filter by language, you can filter by source, you can filter by all sorts. But the fellow that designed it has given us an API. So if you're a wee bit more inclined to pull data out, there's instructions of how to just type a little bit of code into your browser. It's all given for you. And then it spews out all this information in intimidating machine readable format. But once you've got that, if you're so inclined, you can begin to do a wee bit of processing. So last night I pulled out all 2,500 names and just coded them by their altitude. And unsurprisingly, you get loads and loads of names coming down the valley on this fertile land. And at the red dots at higher altitude up at Kersefair, you begin to spread out. You could do this with anything. You could do with how Gaelic's distributed or how Gaelic is taken on by Scots and so on. So here's something you can do. So I pulled out all the names with fell and hill and nows at the end. And as Gilbert was saying, the wee yellow dots fell are really rare, which is quite surprising in as much as if you go over to Wigtonshire, not by the coast in Wigtonshire, but out in the moors high up, you get hundreds and hundreds of fells. I'm not quite sure why you get in the lakes, and then we have a wee break in the Galloway Glens, and that comes back. And as you can see, you get a wee idea of the distribution and the idea of the frequency. Hundreds of hills, quite a lot of nows. And well, maybe not oddly, but interestingly, you get lots of hills up in the high regions. And this might be to do with sort of confusion with the surveyors, because a hill in Scots doesn't just mean a hill bit. It's sort of how landscape is used. It can be like how things are farmed. And Michael Ansell's written some interesting stuff about how perhaps the surveyors heard hill and just applied it to big high up things. So heaps to explore that way. As Gilbert was saying, there's hundreds of Gaelic in Galloway, there's hundreds of Gaelic in Scotland. And while it's really exciting to be able to go into the database, look up a name and find out what it is, you can use the resource in the database to explore place names all across our region. Essentially, could do it across the country as well. So this is a wee heat map of 1,800 Gaelic names. There's just a sample. I mean, there's about 1,700 just in Wigtonshire. As you can see, all of Dumfries and Galloway has got a Gaelic presence, fades off a bit out Eskdale way, but like Upper Nithsdale, Sankers, packed full of it. Great big concentration in the Rins, and great big concentration in our area here, well, up the valley a wee bit. So what can you do? If you're interested in Gaelic names, you could pop into the element glossary, type in or sort of select Gaelic, and if you've got an idea of what you're looking for, you could go and find it. You kind of need to really be sure of what you're doing, but you can also just search for text strings. So there's a place out by me called Carsgowan. If I want to find out what the Gowan element meant, I could type in Gowan. I could click on Drumgowan, it would tell me that drum is droim, it's a ridge, and then we've got two options for what that Gowan bit is. Might be a blacksmith, might be the word for a calf, and you can use the resource like this for loads of stuff. You can, anything you're interested in, you can have a look. Scots name. I mean, place names aren't quite as easy as this. You might get it wrong, but it's a way of exploring the landscape. It's a nice thing to be able to do. So, while just going and being able to find the answers to something is really nice, finding out what it means, part of the attraction of place name study is being able to find out new stuff, or record stuff that hasn't been found or discussed already. So, the database is really pretty comprehensive, but if you're so inclined, there's still quite a lot that can be added to it, and quite a lot that is probably just lurking in local folks' heads, things that you probably think is just common knowledge or stuff, but just hasn't been picked up. And we're really lucky in that Galloway started thinking of itself in the 19th century as a separate entity and was really excited about Galloway as a region, and it started producing a lot of literature about itself in a way that Dumfries, for example, didn't until a wee bit later. We get tens and tens of thousands of pages of 19th century literature collecting folklore, collecting names and stuff like that. And there's a wee set of examples, but there's probably hundreds of texts people might have lying around at home or have got you can find on the internet. And there's lots that we can find out. So lots of the stories behind names in the database come from the Ordnance Survey name books. And these are a great resource, and we're really lucky to have them. South of the border, we lost most of them all. Southampton Blitz, where the OS had its HQ, was destroyed. We've got a couple left. But you can sometimes get the impression that the stories that are recorded in the name book are the definitive article. But what they really are is they're just capturing a little point in time about how people thought about names and thought about the stories behind them. And what I thought I'd show you is just some examples of where you can find different stories or different interpretations or different names in local literature. You might have it in your house, you might have read it already. So one example is Walter Gregor's reports on folklore. He wrote 2 reports on Scottish folklore. We've got 733 entries in them, and they're all fascinating. And if you go down to 652, you find that there's a story told in Corsic about something that happened in Dalry, about somebody going on a funeral cortege, and they arrive at a place called Bargain Strand, which is quite interesting because we get a Scots name for Bargain Strand. And we find out that it wasn't an old woman in this story that had sold to the deal. It was a man that had sold himself to the devil, and rather than living conveniently to the stream, this is just where he'd made the compact with the devil for the deal to tack his ain. And it might be that this story is still told somewhere. There might be more to it, and this is something that local folk can offer the database and can offer place name study in general, is these extra stories that cling to places. It's not just that there's one true fact behind the story. People repeat and recycle and change these stories. Another example is the Score, which is a really cool place up on Waterside Hill. And the name book tells us that a farmer was passing a church. He was chased by fairies, chased up the hill. He took his sword and he cut out a circle to protect himself from the fairies. But in Galloway, we know that that guy from Knocksheen was Adam Forrester, and sort of like this proto-Tam O'Shanter figure. And it'd be quite nice if Tam O'Shanter's story really came from Galloway rather than Ayrshire. And we're told he's chased by witches. And Robert Trotter's Lowering Castle way back in 1822 gives us another name for it. He didn't call it the Score, he called it the Witch Score. And he tries to protect himself not from fairies, but from witches there. And I'd heard from somebody, so 50 years later, we're told that people still cleared out the Score as a memory of this event. And it was monitored every year. I was told that this still happened about 30 years ago. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but if you know somebody from Waterside, there's a chance that the Score was still being cleared up. And I won't go through every possible example, but there's a tiny place called Jean's Waz up in Balmaclellan. And John Nicholson's Historical Tales gives us 7 whole pages of lore about Jean's Waz. I mean, in this case, I'm not sure if it's super relevant to the place name itself. I think it's called Jean's Waz. Waz is like an old dilapidated building. But it's nice to have 7 whole pages behind it. And I thought I'd give you one more example, which is in Daft MacTaggart, as he's unkindly called. John MacTaggart's a Galloway legend. He compiled this dictionary and encyclopedia of Galloway words. And if you go through the cat section, past cat kindness and cat lils and cat out the poke and cat stain, and just above cat huns, you find that Catstran is a wee Galloway name for a wee stream. And so the database says this is probably cat plus strand, but there's a chance that cat strands round here took on, perhaps as originally cat plus strand, but it became formalised as a name for a wee stream in Galloway. And so I'm not suggesting that folk go and systematically read through all these sources, although, I mean, it is kind of worth doing. But often people will pick up, Harper's Rambles in Galloway, and they'll read about places close to their home. And quite often you'll find information that's just not known. And it'd be great to pass it on. It adds to the tapestry of names that we've got. In some respect, though, we don't really need to worry about all these things. They're in libraries, they've been digitized, they're safe. Eventually we'll get through them all. In 20 years, there'll probably be some sort of algorithm that can just algorithmically extract all this information. But what we are at risk of losing is names that haven't been mapped yet. And there's thousands and thousands of names that people use for small features. And while you've got 2,500 in these few parishes, these entries probably are only there because they've been picked up by the Ordnance Survey first 170 years ago. The Ordnance Survey couldn't map everything, and it also mapped things that they thought were important. And what they thought was important was usually, well, they had they had like a hierarchy of importance when they were mapping things. And rich folk, they came higher up. Rich landowners were higher up than your tenant farmer and stuff. So we tend to have a particular view preserved in the OS, and then that's cycled on a wee bit. But I was looking over at OpenStreetMap, and I couldn't help noticing this tiny wee point, a tiny wee green dot there, and somebody's taken the trouble to map Lightning Tree, which I think is this tree here. And I was able to get in touch with him, and he said, it's called the Lightning Tree because it was hit by lightning. But you won't find this on any map other than OpenStreetMap, where someone took the time to add it. And there's loads of things like this everywhere. And one of the interesting things about place names is that you get to see how people that aren't usually represented in historical records interacted with the landscape. Usually we don't get a farmer's perspective in the early medieval sources, and place names are one of the few ways we get that. But they're interesting historically, but they're interesting now, just now as well. And people structure their interaction with the landscape and structure their mental map and structure memories by places and what they call them. And it would be nice to collect these. It'd be nice to have a way of collecting these wee minor names, because these will become historical soon. It'd be nice in 200 years when folk are looking at the Galloway Glens database in 2200, for them to find out what people found important now and not just recycled from earlier sources. And I'll maybe skip quickly over some Scots names, and I'll talk about how you could maybe record all this information. So one last thing to say about the OS is that it's fab, it's brilliant, but they did such a good job that people have basically copied them for 170 years. One of the things the OS did was it kind of systematically anglicised lots of Scots elements. So your stains become stones, your brigs become bridges, your lake becomes low. And you can see this happening in real time in Upper Nithsdale, because just before the OS came, the Duke of the Blue went out and got folk to map his stuff. So we've got lake top holes, Todd holes, Foxhole, name of a farm in Kirkconnell in 1856. And then the very next year, the OS comes and it becomes low Todd holes. And this happens everywhere. And another thing local folk can contribute is how are these names recorded, given, spoken in Scots? Because that will go quite soon. If you're just going by maps and road signs, which are in anglicised form, these Scots names, and a wee part of our history and heritage, are going to be lost. So, how might we? Well, there's a wee map of Scots place names that folk on OpenStreetMap have put together. It's really empty in the Galloway Glens area. It'd be nice to get some more. So how might you record this sort of stuff? If you've got any stories you've found or local traditions or wee minor names or Scots names that you see aren't recorded, if you go to the Galloway Glens website, there's a contact us page. If you've got anything to do with Borg or field names, borg.org would like it. And on my website, I've made a wee form. You can click on a map and tell me your names, and it gets emailed to me. And I'd love to have all your wee names. And I'll leave you with a wee picture of something else you can do with the API. So I took all the Gaelic names out from the website, and then, for no reason other than it looks quite pretty, I warped the ground by the density. So this isn't the hills, this is just the high points are where there's lots of Gaelic, and then there's this wee north face of the Eiger there in the central bit where there's hundreds of Gaelic, and then you see it jumping about elsewhere. So, to conclude, the database is awesome, you should explore it, but there's still stuff that can be found, and it's fun to look it up. If you could send it to these guys, or to Borg, or to me, it would really be nice to keep it before it's lost. It might get lost. Thanks very much, folks.
Thanks so much. Maybe if the three speakers are willing to come, there's a slight Westlife boy band situation here. The three seats. Didn't Thomas Clancy suggest Treff was potentially borrowed into the local Gaelic language in Galloway, and therefore these three names are actually Gaelic coinings?
I have wondered about that. Some of the Trev names are absolutely clearly come from this Brittonic language, languages like Welsh. You can see that in the way they're constructed, but some of them, and this is true up in Ayrshire as well, where you get these names up in like near Drongan and Ochiltree as well. Some of them have second elements, or they've been sort of warped in ways that make it look like maybe this element Trev came into Gaelic, at least in the kind of later part of the period, and was it would be the easiest thing to do, because Gaelic has a word Trev, which kind of means roughly the same thing. It would be a very easy word to be borrowed into Gaelic. So a few of the names look as if there's maybe been, but it's something that I've kind of broached the idea and run away. I mean, I haven't actually done the proper research on it yet. But yeah, I have suggested that. I'll send something to you.
I have a question here, probably for all three of you, or maybe come to you along the line, if that's okay, which is, were there any surprising place names which appeared particularly out of their expected time period? Brythonic place names appearing surprisingly late, or Gallic names appearing surprisingly early, or anything that you found in the project? Is there anything that comes to mind if I come to you, first of all?
In terms of timing, the name that springs to mind immediately is Lanarkos, but that's not in our area, but it could be an example of the kind of thing this question deals with. So Lanark is a Brittonic word, but it looks as if the second element is Augustin, but Austin. But that's where there's an Augustinian prior, isn't there? But that was founded in the late 12th, early 13th century, which means it would be evidence of a Lanark Brittonic name. There would be evidence of continuing Brittonic speech at the time when this Augustinian monastery was founded. And that is a bit surprising. I think Alan James first mentioned that possibility. So those kinds of, I guess that's the kind of surprise he's talking, or she is talking about. Nothing quite like that. I mean,
I mean that's where one of this idea about Trev coming into Gaelic is partly comes from this slightly hard to understand name Tralalan. It's very hard to figure out what the second bit of it is. It's Trev, the farmstead of what's the Lallan or Lollan, and one idea has been that it may be the surname that comes into Balmaclellan as well is the personal name Gilla which lies behind the name MacLellan. So this might be the farmstead of someone called Gilla but Gilla is a very Gaelic personal name. So if that's incorporated in this Trev name, then you're dealing with a 12th, 13th century name maybe. If that's a Trev name being coined in the 12th, 13th century, then something different is going on than we thought was going on there. So it needs, that might be another, I don't know if you've got any, you've got plenty of surprising names.
It's surprising names, yeah, maybe not by dating, I don't think I can pull that out of my head, but I think distribution-wise it's quite interesting, and it's nice to have the whole record of the Galloway Glens. So you've got really strong Gaelic presence in Wigtonshire, a really strong presence in the Glens, and then it's the way that it jumps across the east of Scotland. So by the time you get to Berwickshire, you've got 6 Gaelic names or something like that. And I think the interesting thing is how close we are here to Upper Nithsdale. So although it's Dumfriesshire, it seems to be part of the same continuum. So, for example, Paul names that you get in streams, the fact that it sort of runs, and I think Ayrshire too, runs sort of from north Dumfriesshire down. So all these little micro distributions of Gaelic, that's quite interesting, I think.
Can I add one little surprising thing? So there are mistakes in the database. You'd be unsurprised here. So I was playing around with it the other day for just the dates of things. I just brought up the element Burn just to look, and there was one Burn name which was recorded before 1100, which really surprised me. Because it really shouldn't have been there, and it was the Goat House Burn. I thought we can't possibly have a source for the Goat House Burn before 1100. I looked deeper into it, and it turned out that when the Ordnance Survey record date was put in, it came out as 185 AD rather than 1854, and that's why it was such an early recorded name. So that was very surprising. But there are mistakes there. So if people are playing around with this and they see mistakes, don't sit to yourself, God, that database is full of mistakes. Send us emails and we will correct them, sometimes in real time.
There are a few down in the north of Wales, and I imagine that's not because folk from Galloway have travelled there, but it's maybe a decimal point in the longitude and latitude.
It happens. Well, tell us about that, and we will.
But it's good to find them.
I've heard that the Gaelic spoken in Galloway was Irish Gaelic. Is this true? And how different would the place names be if they were in Scottish Gaelic? I don't know. Could I come to you, Thomas, for that?
Yeah. So there's quite a bit of research been done on this recently by my colleague in Celtic and Gaelic in Glasgow, Robbie O'Malley. He published a big article in a recently published book that Michael Ansell, the late Ted Cowan, and Ronnie Black published, the name of which keeps Galloway the Lost Gaelic
Province.
I think is the name. I should know. I'm in the book. He's done a lot of work on just what was different about Galloway Gaelic. I wouldn't say that it was Irish Gaelic, in the sense that it was Gaelic and it was spoken in Scotland. So, and in lots of different ways in terms of the words used in it, it bears much more close relationship to Gaelic as spoken elsewhere in Scotland. But there are elements in it, and there are ways in which there are little features of the Gaelic as it seems to have been spoken here, which look a little bit more like they like they do in parts of Ireland, in the north of Ireland at any rate. So there must have been something different about it. Of course, Gaelic kind of died out here in this 15th, 16th, 17th century. So what you're also missing is, whereas it developed in all sorts of different ways further north in Scotland. So you're kind of not comparing like with like, you're comparing Gaelic that kind of died out in the 16th, 17th century with Gaelic that kept going for another, is still going in different ways in other parts of the island. And you're dealing with a Gaelic that interacted differently here with the other languages that were there before them. So, I mean, what Gilbert was saying about the element Kirk, I mean, it was clearly brought into place names in Gaelic here, but not elsewhere in Scotland. So and there are other words that look like they were borrowed in either from the local Brittonic speakers or the local Old English speakers, brought into the Gaelic of this region and kind of stayed here. Occasionally they get put into the wider Gaelic speech community. So there are lots of little features of it that my colleague Robbie could explain in much gorier detail than I'm prepared to do tonight. But there are some quite finely grained features, and the way we know about it, any of this is the place names. I think that's the punchline here, because we have no written texts in Gaelic from this part of the world, or maybe one on a good day seen in the right light. It's that the place names are Gaelic texts from the air, but they are very eloquent about certain aspects of the language.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. To touch on the complexity possibly behind the scenes there.
Yeah.
So thank you. Lots more questions coming in here. I'm conscious of time, so I'll pick up just to come to you. Do place names indicate that Gaelic lords planted settlers from northern homeland, or was there a more natural and gradual introduction of native Gaelic? Have you anything to say to that question?
I wouldn't say it was plantation. I would say there's an expansion, which Thomas has written about at some length. The Gal Gael are this probably originally Outer Clyde area polity of Gaelic-speaking people with some Norse look to them. Some of a lot of their personal names, like Somerled, for example, or who else springs to mind, that are Norse in character, but their Lamont is another one.
So it's a slightly more organic process rather than.
So there is a settlement of Norse speakers in parts of Scotland where they assimilate quickly into Gaelic speech, into Christianity as well. So they did. We have mid-9th century burials of very typical Viking style with weapons and horses and weighing scales, which are common to appear quite often in Viking graves, for indicating some kind of merchant being buried there. But they're marked with crosses at either end. It looks like a pagan Viking grave, but they've got crosses. There's some engagement with Christianity. There's engagement with local Gaelic-speaking lordships. There's engagement with a language, and there's probably intermarriage going on as well. So you've got this kind of hybridized culture. the Gal Gael, the term Gal Gael serves that very well. And it expanded from this lower Clyde Bay, so that at one stage, really up until the time when David, the Prince of the Cumbrians, in the early 12th century, up to that point, we seem to have a greater Galloway, which stretches from roughly Paisley on the Clyde, down through Renfrewshire, Ayrshire, and right up the Solway Firth as far as Annandale. We have references to all those areas being occupied by Gal Gael people. And then this Cumbrian princedom is become, by this point, under David I, and then gradually incorporating these. But that map I showed you of the River Ur, where half of Desnes Ioan, has been incorporated into the Diocese of Glasgow. Glasgow Archdiocese, or Glasgow Diocese as it then was the kind of ecclesiastical hat which David's kingdom of the Cumbrians was wearing. It was a kind of metaphor for his control and lordship. And as churches and lands belonging to churches get incorporated into the Diocese of Glasgow, you can see he's munching away like some kind of computer game at the edges of the Gal Gael territory. And that River Ur freezes that process at a particular moment in time, I would say in the early 12th century, when Eddingham, the church at Eddingham, the land at Eddingham, where there was a very important church, just on the east side of the River Ur, it becomes part of the Glasgow's imperium, its dominion of the decreasing territory of Galloway. And you can see him also, he's giving Glasgow Cathedral little bits of cheese from parts of Ayrshire, like the teens of his cane or kine, his tribute in cheese. He's clearly at this point exercising some kind of indirect lordship over the parts of Ayrshire which are still Gal Gael. He does the same in Kintyre, which I think we might also regard as part of Gal Gael territory.
It speaks to more of a gradual rather than a...
And the lordship isn't absolute to begin with. In Kintyre, he says, I give Paisley Abbey the teens of my coin from Kintyre in the years when I can get it. So he's not entirely sure that he's going to get it every year, you know. There's still some dispute over who's in control of these teens.
Well, I think it's worth saying that, for this area, for the Southwest, our records are virtually non-existent before about 1100. And then you get these windows of light in the 12th century. And it's like you're trying to look into what went on before it through the kind of murk of the 12th century and with place names. There must be endless numbers of ways to add up, to kind of view what we're seeing through this kind of murky lens. But I think that sense that we don't actually know what's happening on the ground in the period before 1100.
Brilliant. Thank you. Drumglass, Glasgow, Maize Glass, Finnan Glass, are they connected? Can I come to you, Gilbert?
Well, glass is a colour word. So most things, as is Glasgow. And Gaelic doesn't quite divide up the spectrum as we do it. So glass can be kind of grey, green, blue, shades of, but in forms or intensities or parts of the spectrum which cluster those things together. So it wouldn't necessarily be, a lurid, green of the Hulk or something, or whatever. I'm trying to think of something lurid and green. My mind has gone blank.
Colour. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Gaelic colour words don't divide up the spectrum and the intensities of a colour the same way that we do in English. So, glass is a very common colour word in place.
And the same is true in Brittonic and Welsh, but glass in Welsh isn't quite the same as glass in color resonance is slightly different than it is in Gaelic, which is a bit of a head melt. So, anyway, there you go.
Thank you so much. I've got a question here. It's not technically place names, but it's a fact that I've been telling people, so I'd love to know if you think it's correct or not. You mentioned the Galloway Hoard. Although discovered by metal detectorists, it was actually excavated by Andy Nicholson, our regional archaeologist, who describes the upper hoard as possibly sacrificial because the ground below it had been carefully cleared, and he continued on down to the deeper hoard only because of the metal detector that was pinging.
Yeah.
Anything come to
I think sacrificial, not in a ritual sense of sacrifice, but just simply in the sense, if somebody comes along and discovers my hoard, I will sacrifice the top part and hope that they don't find the bottom part, which is more carefully hidden under a layer of gravel under the top part. I don't think it was regarded as a
sacrificial like that. So you take that and run.
If you thought someone was going to burgle your house, and they were going to hide for one particular drawer, you might hide stuff in the top drawer, so they'll just take that and hide the really good stuff down below.
You think there might be an element to that?
I mean, I'm not recommending this as a home security.
Home security. And then the final question here, sorry, just unless there's any hands up in the room, but the final question here is why are there so many Galloway place names that also appear in Cumbria? Examples coming to mind of Parton, Thornhill, Rockcliffe, etc. Do these names crop up at all at similar time when one language is dominant, or is this something that maybe just generally has come up through the project that you've done?
Well, there's, I suppose, names like that, which we'd regard as Scots up here. There's languages don't respect boundaries quite like we do, and so there's quite a lot of crossover between what we call Northern English and Southern Scots. People forming names from the same sort of name stock. The interesting thing is the further west you go, Galloway Scot seems to operate in a bit of a different way. So lots of the elements you do see from Berwickshire and Northumbria and stuff don't appear with the same frequency in Galloway. Now's probably the best example of that. Lots of your other, Burn as well, which comes up everywhere, lots of other Scots, Northern English ones don't. And that's sort of because Gaelic has sucked up all the resources and we recycle the names. That's one of the reasons.
So it might be oversimplistic just to look at it across the water issue or something like that.
I mean, just one of our problems is the border in terms of research as well. So few projects to do with place names have actually crossed that border. English place name studies sort of operates in a slightly different way. So there are people who've done it. But it's one of the frustrating things is that like even creating a distribution map of elements between Dumfriesshire and Cumbria is not easy.
I've tried it with Sykes. So Sykes, a word, it turns up, I think maybe once, I think we've got a Sykes in the year. So Sykes, an Eastern Scots word for a burn. And you get this heaps in Eskdale and heaps across the border. But oddly, there is a gap. It's probably a geographical rather than a political one. But yeah, it'd be lovely to see more work cross border. Yeah, it's a tricky problem.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just massive thanks to our speakers tonight. Can we do a round of applause, please, for the speakers tonight? And I'm reliably informed that a good few people are clapping at home as well. So that's just, if you could keep that in your minds as well to really embellish that. Two things I'd just like to say very quickly. So we've got the next talk in our winter programmes 2 weeks tonight, talking about salmon smolts entirely online and book through Eventbrite as normal. And I'll send an email out to everybody tomorrow, whether you attended online or you come out tonight, with an ability to book onto that, but also asking for feedback. We've suddenly got very interested in feedback in our last year of the Galloway Glens scheme. So if you find yourself hit with a questionnaire, how did you find it, or anything like that, any feedback, very much welcome. But if I could just end, thanks to everybody involved tonight, massive thanks to our speakers, and for those of you that are interested, I'll see you there in a fortnight. Brilliant. Thank you.